Hello, my name is Samuel Hill, and I am here with Dr. Christopher Dreisbach for Federalism Month. Thank you for being with us today, Christopher.
Glad to be here.
All right. So before we get started, could you introduce yourself to us? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. I'm full-time at Johns Hopkins University, director of the organizational leadership master's degree, having moved there fairly recently from the Division of Public Safety Leadership, where I was a director. This was at another school at Hopkins. And that I think will be somewhat relevant to our conversation about the Constitution. I've been teaching for almost 40 years. In September, I'll celebrate my 40th anniversary.
Congratulations.
Got my degrees in philosophy, my master's and PhD in philosophy at Hopkins. I've never really gotten too far away from Hopkins. I also am permanent part-time on the faculty of St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, where I teach moral and systematic theology. And I'm an Episcopal priest at a church called Old St. Paul's in Baltimore. That's pretty much what I do.
Well, thank you. It's very nice to be with you today, Chris. So we here at the Center for Constitutional Studies first heard about you when we encountered your book, Constitutional Literacy, a 21st Century Imperative. Could you tell us a little bit about that book and where it came from?
Yeah, what got me interested in constitutional literacy in the first place, and that what led to this book eventually, was an assignment back in 2000 when my boss at the time in the Division of Public Safety Leadership asked me to design a course on ethics in the Constitution for our students, almost all of whom were police. And my boss was a retired cop as well. And so he took very personally this idea that even though police take an oath to the Constitution, they don't really get much of an education in it for the most part. In most academies, especially back in 2000, the extent of their constitutional training was learning about a few court cases that would affect their practice directly. So he asked me to design an ethics course involving the Constitution as part of the professional obligations of a cop. And I assumed that I could take my, at that time, 20 years worth of teaching ethics and the Constitution and just put them together over a weekend and come up with a course. Well, I was kind of surprised by my own illiteracy. I mean, I think I'd gotten an A in my civics class in high school back in the 70s, but boy, I did not know the Constitution. And so I worked very hard to develop this. The hardness was in my bringing myself up to a certain level of literacy, given how illiterate I was. So I worked diligently, maybe that's a better word to put it, to produce the course. And then I discovered over time how many people who have taken an oath to the Constitution clearly don't know it. And this became evident in their invoking it. I would also give them a test at the very beginning, something they weren't graded on, but I just wanted to see how much about the Constitution they knew. And it was a little startling how little they knew. And then I started kind of expanding my constitutional literacy radar, and I would hear public officials all the time claiming to invoke the Constitution when they weren't. Frequently, they were invoking the Declaration of Independence. And then I started to think, well, how many aspects of our lives are governed by the Constitution in ways that are fairly profound, even though we don't realize it? And so at that point, I started paying much more attention to this notion of the role of the Constitution in American life and the distance between what we thought we knew about it and what's probably the case. And at some point, an editor friend of mine with whom I had done another text asked if I had any books in mind, and I mentioned this one, and she said, yeah, write that. And so out came the book.
I've been reading it. It's really quite a wonderful book, and it does cover some of the things that you talked about. Your introduction goes over a number of cases of public officials from the very, very top to, the very, very local who invoke the Constitution. and that's a word that you like to use, is to invoke it without having a really good understanding of that.
Right.
And since we're talking here about constitutional literacy this week, that the level of literacy has really come home to us. Now, you give what you call a working definition of constitutional literacy in your book. You say it is knowledge of the Constitution sufficient to invoke it properly. Can you explain that for us, please?
Yeah, knowledge of the Constitution sufficient to invoke it properly means, I think, that we are obliged at any point where we invoke the Constitution to know it well enough that our invoking of it isn't inauthentic or false, perhaps. I think you'll probably get to this before we finish. I think there are various levels of invoking it and therefore various levels of required literacy. So that a person who is voting, for example, is invoking a constitutional right. And now it's interesting that the Constitution itself doesn't specifically lay out a right to vote, but legislation that permits the voting obviously has come out of the Constitution's conferring powers on certain people to issue those rights. When you hear in public conversation, either very casual conversation or say a letter to the editor or something like that, frequently you'll find people invoking the Constitution to back up their claim of a certain right or their claim of a certain wrong. I'm using the term ambiguously there. Or their suspicion that somehow a constitutional law has been broken or something like that. Now, the ordinary citizen is not so burdened by the obligation to constitutional literacy as, say, a Supreme Court justice, or even as anybody who has taken an oath to the Constitution. And so one of the things I wanted to suggest was that literacy doesn't come in one size only. The requirement for literacy matches one's attempt to invoke it. And so the ordinary citizen probably is not as engaged in invoking it as, say, a Supreme Court justice or even a cop. So I meant by invoking it any time one either says something or acts in such a way that the Constitution is the premise for it.
So you talk about different levels of constitutional literacy based upon how much or what your role is in invoking it. And in the book, you describe 8 levels of constitutional literacy, and you describe them pretty thoroughly. Could you just give us a rundown of like sort of the major levels? What are the major benchmarks for different groups or for different activities?
Yeah, forgive me for not having ever memorized that list. I'm gonna have to just look at that. So yeah, and this was my initial effort. I've actually kind of refined it a little bit, but this will do the trick, I think, for our conversation. So the 8 levels of literacy. The most basic one, it seems to me, is the ability to distinguish the Constitution from other documents. You don't even have to, at this point, it's enough, for example, to know that the Constitution is not the Declaration of Independence, is not the Gettysburg Address, so forth and so on. The second level is knowledge of the basic history and basic anatomy of the Constitution. Now, when people begin to talk about that history, they sometimes get it wrong. For example, the primary purpose of the Constitution was to develop a national defense and a national tax system. And it was meant to remedy some of the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation, which had given the states a lot of autonomy and power over themselves, but hadn't really brought the nation together in a meaningful national way. The third level, knowledge of certain significant details from the Articles and Amendments. I think at the point where someone claims to know that the Constitution says such and such, they ought to be able to back that up by pointing to the Constitution. I don't mean to pick on low-hanging fruit here, but I'm going to do it anyway. When the president says, I can do anything I want under the Constitution, he's simply wrong.
Yeah.
And one ought to read Article 2 and see just what the president can and can't do. This is also always a problem, of course, in presidential elections, where all of the candidates are making promises that the Constitution simply doesn't allow them to fulfill. The fourth of the 8 levels is knowledge of most details of each article and amendment and the history surrounding its creation and ratification. At this point, I think we leave behind the ordinary citizen who is not otherwise engaged all the time in constitutional matters, but we include, say, opinion leaders, TV spokespeople, for example, or editors who will make a point of citing the Constitution to support a particular political view. And it's important, I think, that they know what they're talking about in the detail.
So
the fifth level,
point, Chris, would you be talking about like the commentators on Fox, CNN, who sit in the chair and tell you, this is what this means?
yes, I would be talking about those kinds of commentators, right?
Yeah.
So a Rush Limbaugh or a Don Lemon, who at the point that they're suggesting either the need to impose some sort of constitutional principle, or they're criticizing someone else for having violated it. It seems to me they should have the detailed knowledge to back up that position. And sometimes even at that level, if you've read the Constitution carefully and really done your historical homework, you'll raise an eyebrow at the very least and say, I don't think that's true. And here, I'm going to make this distinction again, but here I want to distinguish between people who know the Constitution well but disagree on its interpretation, and people who simply have some sort of axe to grind or some sort of agenda and will pull the Constitution out of the air incorrectly to back it up. I think that's a very important difference.
Okay.
So someone like Justice Alito has a very conservative interpretation of the Constitution, but he knows the Constitution. And so when he and Justice Breyer disagree, that's not a sign of illiteracy. That's a sign of different fundamentals, right? The fifth of the 8 is familiarity with the most important arguments for the various elements of the Constitution. And here I think we're now getting really into scholars of the Constitution. Number 6, familiarity with the most famous court cases. There, of course, it's most important when one wants to cite a court case as precedent for some sort of constitutional position. 7, familiarity with key disagreements about the nature of laws, rights, and justice, and which theories are reflected in the Constitution as opposed, for example, to the Declaration. This becomes important when we want to make certain claims about rights as if the Constitution supported them, or we want to make certain claims about a law. Because here again, I think the mistake sometimes is to cite the wrong theory. There are very specific theories of rights, justice, and laws. And the Constitution and the Declaration have very different versions of those theories underlying them when compared to each other. So that people who are, as scholars, responsible for moving forward the constitutional health of the country, it seems to me, ought to be very clear on those distinctions. And then finally, level 8 is familiarity with the more arcane debates about, for example, the history and nature of constitutional interpretation. At that point, we're talking about the Supreme Court justices, I think, primarily.
So one of the things that we do here at the Center with the Federalism Index Project, and my research in particular, is on constitutional knowledge. And so there, it's sort of it's a strange thing that's going on. There was this surge in interest in educating about civics. And so what we're finding is at the sub-college level, there's actually been quite an increase in teaching about federalism and about other issues.
Oh, that's good news.
It is qualified good news.
Oh, okay.
Because what we're finding out, so the ANES, the American National Election Studies, they have been asking this question since about 1964. How many branches of government are there?
Mm-hmm.
And the average across, 50 years, I think now, is 30% of people can name all 3 of our branches of government.
Oh, my. Yes, okay.
100%. And then Justice O'Connor, in her work on iCivics over the last few years, has also found some of these funny conflicting things where they can name a branch of government, probably can't tell you what it actually does or where in the Constitution that's coming from. And so, are we educating for literacy? In some ways, we absolutely are. But much like your case, and the case was the same with me, is I remember having things about the Constitution. But when I got to be, in my 30s and really start thinking about it, I was like, I don't actually remember all that much. And I would make some of these same mistakes you're talking about, and I would claim something and someone would come back at me and I'd have to go look it up and, oh, what do you know? I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And so that has informed a lot of my education, but yeah, it seems like a lot of our people are struggling to acquire even a basic understanding.
I think you're right about that struggle to acquire a basic understanding. And I want to be fair here in reminding, I mean, I said this already, but I need to say it again, that had I not been assigned the task of creating a course on this, I think I'd be in the same boat right now, frankly. I would just harbor my political biases and assume that they were backed up by the Constitution. And unless anybody challenged me, I wouldn't have picked the Constitution. I wouldn't have picked up the Constitution and read it to double check. So I don't mean to take a holier than thou position here. I get it. I get that people who are not otherwise engaged in the Constitution proper have other things to do. And so I don't want to come across as a snob or a holier than thou because I understand that. I think it's too bad, and that's part of the point of the book. But I would not have thought it was too bad if I hadn't been assigned the task of designing the course. I would have just never given it much thought.
So suddenly there's a need and everyone's flipping through their Constitution.
Right.
So now, there have been people who make the argument that we spent centuries without a particularly constitutionally literate population, and we did fine. Now, your book seems to argue against that. Why do you think that that's the case?
Okay, so the question is, why do I think we really need constitutional literacy when the world has done fine without it? Let me first of all agree with that point. I mean, even among cops, cops can go 35 years, do their job very well, be celebrated at their retirement quite properly, and not once have picked up a constitution in their entire career. I would answer the question, first of all, by suggesting the historical fact that literacy has always been an advantage over illiteracy. So even if people could get along fine being illiterate, being literate made a positive difference, number one. Number two, it's one thing merely to express one's own opinions and accept the reasonability or rationality of such an opinion. It's another to say, and my opinion is grounded in, fill in the blank with a certain document. The Bible says, the Constitution says, our state code says, our federal code says. And if they're wrong, if the document simply doesn't say that, and here we're not arguing about interpretation, it's just not there, then it seems to me you've uttered a falsehood. Now, that's not the same necessarily as lying, because if you really believe what you're saying, that's not lying, but you're still perpetrating a falsehood. So to the extent that somebody wants the Constitution to, or even if not, maybe not want us, but even as somebody presents the Constitution, to the extent that they present a Constitution as the foundation of their proposition, it seems to me they're obliged to know it. So can the world get by on illiteracy? Sure. We've done it for the history of the human race. Are we better off with literacy, especially when it's literacy about the documents we're purporting to invoke? Yeah, I think it's much better.
Okay. So it's a question of trajectories, I suppose. Do we want to be going up a little or going up a little more?
Yeah, yeah, fair enough.
And so you talk about sort of this perpetuating a falsehood. Now, is that related to your moral versus practical value of literacy, or would you classify that as something separate?
No, I think it's a piece of it. And it's interesting you should bring that up about the difference between the practical and moral values of literacy. The reason it's interesting to me is because I have to confess that even as I began writing the book, I was seeing this as an exercise in ethics primarily. And it dawned on me that the very things I was saying suggested a distinction between the practical applications of the Constitution and invoking it and the moral implications. And I mean, when, for example, a legislator is sitting down to propose the enactment of a certain law, the legislator should know what the scope and limits of that enactment can be under the Constitution. And I don't know that that knowledge is necessarily a moral concern. Maybe in broader terms it is. I mean, the person made a promise to be a good legislator, but at this moment, it's really a practical question. Does the Constitution allow me to do this? Yes or no? Because if the answer is no, I'm not going to go any farther with it. At that point, I don't think it's really a moral question. It's just more of a practical question. And so at the point I arrived at the book, where I realized that, I had to pull back. It took a little more time then to produce that chapter than I'd anticipated, because I hadn't really been careful about the distinction myself. So I do want to make that case that when I'm talking about constitutional literacy, even if in the broad terms I'm proposing it as a moral obligation, I want to suggest that there are certain values of that literacy that really are much more practical than they are morally significant.
So it almost sounds, the way you describe that practical value of, say, the legislator sitting down, it almost sounds like taking the moment to look at the Ninth and 10th Amendment and internalize the message of, you don't have all the power. Okay, well, now which powers do I have? And just make a very real decision of, do I or don't I have the legitimacy, the authority to do this?
Yes, that point about sitting down and taking a look at the Ninth and 10th Amendments is an excellent point. And of course, very much plays into the whole question of federalism, right? So part of the question that the Constitution could answer is that, what are the federal government's powers vis-a-vis the states in terms of what the Constitution has said, right? Now, at this point, the debate may rage. I mean, obviously, a fundamental debate in our political lives in this country goes all the way back to the beginning. Even though Washington had begged us not to split into parties, by John Adams, we had parties. And so on the Adams side, they call themselves Federalists, but many of them, I think, were actually more inclined to believe that the nation is the fundamental political unit and the states are subordinate to it, which really isn't federalism. It's a sort of internal nationalism. And then, of course, the other party was it was called the Democratic Republican Party at the time, included Jefferson most notably, but it was states' rights people. And they believed that the state was the fundamental political unit and that the nation was there to serve the interests of the states. And so out of this tension comes federalism. And what's interesting about that attempt to meet both sides of the argument is how broad it is. So one can still insist on the priority of the nation over the states and claim to be federalist. And one can claim that the state's sovereignty has priority over national interest and can still claim to be a federalist. I mean, it's interesting that most so-called anti-federalists weren't anti-federalist. They just didn't grab the title in time, right? The so-called federalists grabbed the title before the other side had a chance to name itself.
First to press, I guess.
Yes, yeah. And so even those who take a very close look at the Ninth and 10th Amendments and have absorbed the content and the potential meanings may still end up disagreeing with each other, but at least they've made the effort. And much of that effort is practical, not just moral, but practical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So would you argue that a practical understanding or practical appreciation of constitutional literacy is more valuable than, say, a moral view or a moral perspective for most people?
Um, I think it might be more of an inducement to make that distinction, because once you put a moral color to the importance of pursuing the Constitution and the constitutional literacy, then it seems to me you're kind of putting people on the spot. When you say to somebody in purely practical terms, look at what you could gain by constitutional literacy, I think it's less threatening and less controversial. I'm not sure I want to make too black and white a distinction, because there is always, I think, a moral obligation to do our best, and to do our best as citizens, to do our best if we're sworn officers in our profession, having taken the oath. And so while we might encourage constitutional literacy by referring to its practical value first, because it'll be less controversial and less demanding,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say it's completely detached from the moral value.
So perhaps this is a milk and a meat issue where, if you're just walking in the door at a level 1 or a 2, it's easier to encourage someone to internalize this, to learn about this, if we can show them there's value here. And then as they begin to recognize it, we can teach them more about the why and the deeper meanings and philosophies.
Yes, I like that point about the milk and the meat. I mean, one of the interesting things I have found working with the police on this is, although I will have mentioned up front the moral implications of having taken an oath of the Constitution and then living up to that oath, for the better part of our conversation, we just get into really neat historical conversations. We talk about court cases and how interesting the reasoning was in them. And so the real enthusiasm, I think, in the conversation comes from a more practical approach. Even if the moral imperatives are lurking in the background, the real excitement comes from just learning more and saying, gee, I didn't know that. Wow, that's pretty cool. And before you know it, they're starting to do the research on their own. They're picking up books on constitutional history and stuff. So at the very least, emphasizing the practical early on, I think, can make constitutional literacy more attractive than if we impose a heavy morality on it. So the milk and meat analogy, that was neat. That was good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So for the last few minutes, I think I want to kind of look at some big picture questions here.
Sure.
Just in your research and in your writing and in your reading, and this includes also all of your time working in theology and ethics, do you have an idea of how we got here where so few of us understand it and so few of us value that understanding enough to remedy that? How did we get here?
Well, I think the first step is just sort of an historical distance from the roots. I would imagine that many a thinker shortly after the ratification of the Constitution, and for some years afterward, paid very close attention to what was happening to it as court cases arose and questions over legislation arose. But in time, for most of us, it just wasn't important anymore. And unless a teacher said to us, it's important that you do this, I don't even think it would have occurred to us to do it. We've got plenty of other life to live. And unless our opinions and lives are challenged, there's not a lot of good reason to go back to the Constitution and check it. Now, in moments like the civil rights era, you suddenly had constitutional issues front and center again. And I suspect that that got a lot more people interested in looking into this. But then as that began to die down, I suspect people who are not otherwise committed to constitutional scholarship started slipping away again because, gee, I got other things to do. I have a job. And then voting is sort of, I'll take my 15 minutes and go vote. But I think very few of us pause to ask, what are the constitutional implications of what I'm about to do? So I don't blame the masses for having other things to do. I just want to say to them, boy, you'd even be better off. You may be fine, you may be well off, but you'd be even better off if you took a look at this thing and got to know it a little better. So I think we got here in the first place simply because we didn't have to.
Yeah.
And then I may put too much of a premium on education because I'm married to an educator and I'm one myself, but I do think that's the best place to start. Get the kids interested really early on, and not simply, and perhaps this was your civics class too. For mine, it was mostly memorization.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'd like to do is get the kids engaged in critical thought about the Constitution, and they can handle it. You have to use the language of a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, but they like that kind of stuff. To say, is the president a king? And then have that conversation. And so I think, and maybe I'm anticipating a question you're about to ask. I think the first solution is education. It's not the only one, it's the first one. And it may also be the answer to your question, how did we get here? Because I'm not sure education made enough of an effort to keep constitutional literacy on the front burner for us.
Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice O'Connor, has started her iCivics program a number of years ago. And there are a lot of people who have begun these educational initiatives. And Justice O'Connor in particular noted I think it was 2011, they issued a report saying that education, college or otherwise, needs to make constitutional literacy, civic literacy and education central and not peripheral to their curriculum, to make it integral as opposed to just sort of making it a little box off on the side that you just check off by the year's end.
Yes, well, that idea of making constitutional literacy central to education sits very well with me, and I'm all for it, and I think it can be done. You have all of these movements in the history of education in this country, things like writing across the curriculum or critical thinking across the curriculum, where at one time that topic maybe have been the province of one particular academic area or department. We began to see the value of being able to write about anything in any discipline, to think critically about any discipline. And so making room for constitutional literacy, it seems to me, is the proper project. And I think it's quite doable, frankly. I mean, we don't have to overwhelm. We can simply agree that in kindergarten, the children will be introduced for the first time and in a way that gets them curious. And then over time, we keep coming back to it. I'd like to see more of it in public rhetoric. I had done an op-ed piece a few years ago for the Baltimore Sun in which I argued that police are in a really neat position that we haven't taken advantage of to serve as sort of ministers of the Constitution. That if they could get the proper training from the academy onward, then they would be in a position to have conversations with the citizenry about the Constitution. And I realize there are moments where they can't take the time to do that when they're pursuing a murder or something. But how frequently are they simply stopping, say, a motorist or a suspect in a very casual way? Mm-hmm. And the suspect might say something like, I've got my constitutional rights. Well, suppose the police officer were there to say, let's talk about that. Why do you think you have that right? And where might it come from? And so they'd be in a position to educate, and over time, the citizenry would come to see them in that role. So that one might simply stop a cop on the street and say, excuse me, I had this unconstitutional question. I wonder if you can help me with it. And that would really put this front and center, I think.
certainly add a different dynamic to the movies that we always see about somebody yelling at the police for being unconstitutional,
Yes,
and perhaps bring us a little closer to the old police officer where they were seen as a community resource as opposed to an outside invader. That
absolutely. This idea of the police officer as an invader rather than a community resource, I think it's so important. I mean, this is a whole other topic. I just had an interview yesterday about police ethics, so it's sort of in my blood. Um, the Imagine how much good that would do if we went back to community policing, and you had the local beat cop, and he was a neighbor and a friend, or she was a neighbor or a friend. And imagine that that cop was well educated on the Constitution and well educated on how to talk to other people about it. I mean, that would just be a marvelous resource, it seems to me. And even if there was a lot of political disagreement still, at least it would be informed disagreement.
indeed. All right. Thank you so much, Chris. I think I'm probably going to call it there. We're running up on the hour.
Okay.
Um, Thank you so much. I really appreciated this. This was a fascinating discussion, and I look forward to exploring it a little more.